year was 1809, a time when the map of Europe was being violently redrawn by the ambition of Napoleon Bonaparte. The continent was a landscape of shifting borders, burnt gunpowder, and pervasive paranoia. In the shadow of this grand geopolitical theater, a smaller, darker drama was about to unfold, one that would baffle historians and criminologists for over 2 centuries. It concerns a man named Benjamin Bathurst, a young and promising British diplomat who did not die in battle, nor in bed, but simply ceased to exist in the span of a single heartbeat. To understand the sheer impossibility of the incident, one must first understand the atmosphere in which Bathurst was operating. He was only 25 years old, an aristocrat with a bright future, serving as the British envoy extraordinary to Vienna. His mission was critical to the war effort against France, but following the Austrian defeat at the Battle of Wagram, Vienna had become hostile territory. Bathurst was recalled to London, carrying vital dispatches that the British government was desperate to receive. He was a man carrying the weight of an empire in his saddlebags, and he knew well that he was a target. His journey home was a frantic, zigzagging route designed to evade French patrols. He traveled under the alias of Baron de Kock, a merchant, accompanied by his courier and secretary, a Swiss man named Kraus. By the time they reached the small Prussian town of Perleberg on November 25th, Bathurst was a man unraveling. Witnesses later described him as agitated, trembling, and constantly looking over his shoulder. He was convinced that French spies were trailing him, closing in for the kill. Whether this was the heightened awareness of a spy or the onset of a nervous breakdown remains a point of debate, but his fear was palpable. They arrived in Perleberg around midday. It was a gray, unremarkable town, a way station that offered little more than a change of horses and a hot meal. They stopped at the White Swan Inn, an establishment that would soon become the epicenter of an enduring enigma. Bathurst requested fresh horses immediately, intending to press on to Hamburg, and then the safety of a British ship. However, the local postmaster informed him that no horses would be available until evening. This delay seemed to terrify the diplomat. He spent the intervening hours in a state of high anxiety. He wrote letters only to burn them. He checked and rechecked his pistols. He requested that the local military commander, Captain von Klitzing, provide him with a guard. Believing that an assassination attempt was imminent in the hotel itself, von Klitzing obliged, stationing soldiers at the inn. But even this did not quell Bathurst's terror. He refused to shed his heavy fur coat or his sword, pacing the floorboards of his room as the November afternoon faded into a premature, murky twilight. At 7 in the evening, the horses finally arrived. carriage was brought around to the front of the inn. The night was dark, illuminated only by the flickering oil lanterns hanging by the inn door and the handheld lanterns of the ostlers. The air was damp and cold, typical for a Prussian autumn. Bathurst and Cross prepared to depart. The carriage was an open-top carriage, heavily laden with luggage, and the diplomatic pouches that Bathurst had guarded with his life. The sequence of events that followed has been scrutinized 1,000 times, yet the mechanics of it defy logic. Bathurst resolved to wait until the very last moment to enter the carriage, preferring the safety of the inn to the exposed street. Finally, at roughly 9 o'clock, the order was given to leave. The horses were harnessed. The postilion settled into his saddle. Cross, the secretary, busied himself with the luggage at the rear of the vehicle. Benjamin Bathurst stepped out of the inn door. He was wearing his expensive gray fur coat and heavy trousers. He walked toward the carriage, which was parked just a few feet away from the entrance. The lighting was poor, casting long, dancing shadows against the cobblestones, but he was not alone. There were ostlers nearby. The postilion was mounted, and Cross was only yards away. Bathurst moved to the front of the horses, seemingly to check their condition, or perhaps to walk around to the door on the far side of the carriage, away from the light of the inn. He stepped around the heads of the horses, passing from the dim illumination of the lanterns into the shadow cast by the animals themselves. And that was it. He did not emerge on the other side. Cross, finishing with the luggage, waited for his master to climb in. He waited for the shift of weight on the carriage springs, the sound of a boot on the step, the shutting of the door. He heard nothing. After a few moments of silence, Cross called out. There was no answer. Assuming the diplomat had perhaps forgotten something and slipped back inside, Cross checked the inn. Bathurst was not there. He checked the rear of the carriage. He checked the street. The courier asked the postilion where the Baron had gone. The postilion, confused, replied that the gentleman had walked around the horses, and he had not seen him since. Panic began to set in. Cross, now realizing something was terribly wrong, raised the alarm. Lanterns were brought closer, their beams cutting through the dark, sweeping the cobblestones. They looked under the carriage. They looked in the nearby alleyways. They looked in the stables. Benjamin Bathurst, a grown man in a heavy fur coat, had vanished in a space of less than 10 seconds, in an area surrounded by people, without a cry, a struggle, or a sound. The geography of the disappearance makes it even more unsettling. The White Swan Inn was not in a desolate wilderness. It was in a town, on a street. The distance Bathurst walked was negligible. If he had been grabbed, surely the horses would have spooked. Surely the postilion, sitting atop one of those horses, would have felt the disturbance or heard a scuffle. If he had fallen, he would have been found on the ground. If he had run, the sound of his heavy boots on the stones would have echoed in the quiet night. Instead, there was a void. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed him, or as if he had stepped through a tear in the fabric of reality. Kraus rushed to Captain von Klitzing, the military commander who had provided the guards earlier. The captain was a man of action and immediately ordered a citywide search. He assumed, logically, that Bathurst had been snatched by French agents lying in wait. The town of Perleberg was locked down. Soldiers swept through the streets, banging on doors, searching cellars and attics. The river Stepanitz, which flowed nearby, was dragged with hooks and nets. The surrounding woods were scoured by men with dogs. They found nothing. No footprints leading away. No signs of a struggle. No dropped pistol. No hat. The investigation that followed was frantic and thorough, driven by the terrified realization that a British diplomat carrying state secrets had been lost on Prussian soil. Von Klitzing was relentless. He interrogated the innkeeper, the ostlers, and the postilion. He even interrogated Kraus, suspecting the secretary might have murdered his master for the money or the secrets. But Kraus's distress appeared genuine, and he had no opportunity to dispose of a body in those few seconds. Days turned into weeks. The snow began to fall, covering the cobblestones of Perleberg, burying whatever secrets the ground might have held. The disappearance of Benjamin Bathurst began to drift from a police matter into the realm of folklore. How does a man vanish in plain sight? However, the silence of the mystery was eventually broken by a few disturbing physical discoveries, though they did little to solve the riddle. Some weeks after the incident, a pair of pantaloons was found in a wooded area near the town. They were perforated with 2 bullet holes, yet there were no bloodstains on the fabric. In the pocket was a letter from Bathurst to his wife, a partially finished note speaking of his fear and his desire to return home. If these were Bathurst's trousers, how had they been removed? Why were there bullet holes but no blood? And where was the rest of him? Later, an even more grim discovery was made in the outhouse of a local family named Mertens. Hidden in the corner, covered by wood and debris, was the diplomat's grand fur coat. It was the very coat he had been wearing when he stepped around the horses. This discovery implicated the family, who worked at the White Swan, but it raised more questions than answers. Had he been murdered in the inn and his body smuggled out? But how, in the seconds he was outside? And why strip him of his coat and trousers in different locations? The official explanation leaned toward murder and robbery, likely by local vagrants or corrupt servants at the inn, who then disposed of the body so effectively that it was never found. But this theory strains under the weight of the timeline. A murder requires time. A struggle requires noise. A body is a heavy, stubborn object that is difficult to hide, especially with a military garrison tearing the town apart minutes after the fact. Others clung to the theory of French abduction. Perhaps a team of elite commandos had been waiting in the shadows, silenced him instantly with a gag, and spirited him away. But Napoleon himself, when later accused by the British press of the kidnapping, seemed genuinely baffled. He ordered his own inquiry, eager to prove that his agents had nothing to do with such a clumsy and bizarre event. If the French had taken him, they would have boasted of the captured intelligence. Instead, the French archives are silent on the fate of Benjamin Bathurst. The incident at the White Swan left a hole in history. It is a narrative with a beginning and a setting, but no middle and no end. We are left with the image of a young man, breath steaming in the cold November air, stepping into the shadow of a carriage horse. He takes one step, then another. He is there, solid and real, a man of importance and anxiety. And then, in the blink of an eye, he is a ghost, leaving behind only a frantic secretary, a baffled soldier, and a fur coat hidden in a pile of firewood. The cobblestones of Perleberg kept their secret, and Benjamin Bathurst walked out of the 19th century and into the unknown, never to be seen again. The investigation into the vanishing of Benjamin Bathurst begins not with the supernatural, but with the mundane logistics of travel in the early 19th century. To understand the anomalies that plague this case, one must first appreciate the setting. It was the 25th of November, 1809. The Napoleonic Wars had turned Europe into a chessboard of paranoia and espionage. Bathurst, a young and capable British diplomat, was traveling under the pseudonym Baron de Kock. He was racing back to London from Vienna, carrying sensitive documents that the French Empire would have killed to possess. He stopped at the White Swan Inn in the small Prussian town of Perleberg to change horses. The first anomaly is the timeline itself. It is terrifyingly compressed. We are not looking at a man who wandered off into the night and was lost for days. We are looking at a window of seconds. Bathurst had finished a hurried dinner. He was anxious, reportedly jumping at shadows, convinced that French spies were tightening a noose around him. He ordered his carriage to be ready by 7 in the evening. At the appointed hour, he walked out of the inn door. His valet, a man named Hilbert, stood near the carriage door. His secretary, Croz, was steps behind him. Bathurst stepped around the heads of the horses to the darker side of the carriage, presumably to inspect the harness, or perhaps to relieve himself before the long journey. And then silence. He never walked around to the carriage door. He never returned to the inn. Hilbert waited. Croz waited. When they finally rounded the horses to see what was keeping the diplomat, the space was empty. The ground was frozen hard, yet there was no sound of running footsteps, no shout of struggle, and no receding carriage wheels. He had simply ceased to occupy the space he stood in. This brings us to the physical evidence, or rather, the bewildering lack thereof, followed by the sudden, disjointed appearance of items that should have remained with him. The most baffling of these discoveries occurred weeks later, on the 16th of December. 2 local women gathering wood in a small forest near the village of Quitzo, roughly 3 miles north of Perleberg, stumbled upon a pair of trousers. These were not the rough-spun clothes of a peasant or a soldier. They were fine pantaloons, the kind worn by a gentleman of status. They were quickly identified as belonging to Benjamin Bathurst. This discovery introduces a jarring inconsistency in the narrative of a simple kidnapping or murder. If Bathurst had been taken by French agents, as his paranoia suggested, why would they strip him of his trousers in a frozen wood 3 miles away? The contents of the pockets deepen the mystery. Inside, investigators found a letter to his wife, Phillida. It was unfinished. The text was scrawled in pencil, speaking of his terrifying fear that he would never reach England, and that his ruin was brought about by Count d'Entraigues, a figure involved in the complex espionage web of the time. But the anomaly here is not just the fear. It is the presence of the letter itself. If he was murdered for his documents, why leave a personal letter? More importantly, the pockets also contained bullets. Bathurst was armed and prepared for a fight, yet no shot was ever heard outside the White Swan. Furthermore, the condition of the trousers suggests they were removed roughly. They were turned inside out, but there were no cuts, no blood, and no signs of the violent struggle one would expect if a man were being forcibly stripped in the Prussian winter. It implies a scenario that is almost impossible to reconstruct logically. That Bathurst was either coerced into undressing or did so himself before disappearing again. Then there is the matter of the fur coat. Bathurst was wearing a heavy, expensive sable coat, a garment worth a small fortune in 1809. It was an item of immense conspicuousness. A man in a sable coat does not blend into the background of a rural Prussian town. When the trousers were found, the coat was missing. It was never recovered. In the realm of criminal investigation, missing high-value items usually point to robbery. If this were a simple brigand attack, the thieves would take the coat, the money, and the watch. However, Bathurst had a significant amount of gold on his person and a valuable watch. The reports on what exactly was found with the trousers vary slightly in historical accounts, but the consensus remains that while the coat vanished, other valuable items were strangely ignored or left behind in the carriage. This selective theft does not fit the profile of a highwayman. It fits the profile of someone who needed the man gone, or perhaps someone who needed the coat to impersonate the man. We must also scrutinize the behavior of the witnesses, specifically the entourage. The valet, Hilbert, and the secretary, Cross, were the last people to see him. Their behavior in the immediate aftermath was erratic. Instead of raising a chaotic alarm the moment Bathurst vanished, there was a strange delay, a hesitation that Captain von Klitzing, the local Prussian military commander investigating the case, found suspicious. Klitzing eventually arrested the servants, suspecting them of foul play, but could extract no confession and found no evidence linking them to a crime. They were released, but the cloud of suspicion never fully lifted. The most psychological anomaly is Bathurst's own mental state. In the days leading up to his arrival in Perleberg, his behavior had deteriorated into acute mania. He traveled with his pistols always at hand. He refused to travel at night, then suddenly decided he must travel only at night. He claimed he had been poisoned. He told his secretary that the walls of his room were transparent and that people were watching him through the stones. To the skeptic, this screams of a mental break, perhaps a psychotic episode induced by stress and exhaustion. If a man believes invisible enemies are watching him, he might flee into the woods of his own accord, shedding his clothes in a state of delirium. This theory holds weight until one considers the political reality. Bathurst was not hallucinating the war. He was not hallucinating the French spies. Napoleon's agents were indeed active in the area, and a British diplomat carrying peace overtures from Austria would be a prime target. The anomaly lies in the intersection of his paranoia and reality. Just because he was paranoid does not mean he was not being followed. In fact, his erratic behavior might have been a performance, or a genuine reaction to a very real, very close threat that his servants were too oblivious to see. For decades, the case rested there. A missing man, a pair of trousers in the woods, and a missing fur coat. It was a perfect locked room mystery, except the room was the outdoors. But the final, and perhaps most chilling, anomaly surfaced long after the trail had gone cold. In 1852, more than 40 years after the disappearance, a house was being renovated in Perleberg. The house stood roughly 300 paces from the White Swan Inn. It had been owned by a man named Mertens, who worked as a porter at the White Swan during the time of Bathurst's visit. During the demolition of a thrashing floor in the stable, workers uncovered a human skull. This discovery sent a shockwave through the cold case. The skull showed signs of massive trauma. It had been fractured by a heavy blow from a blunt instrument, was found buried in the earth beneath the floorboards. Was this Benjamin Bathurst? The dental evidence was compelling. One of the lower molars had been removed, a specific dental procedure that Bathurst was known to have undergone. The age of the skeleton matched. The location, mere yards from where he vanished, was damning. It suggested a crime of opportunity or a hasty concealment. However, a new anomaly arose to complicate even this grim resolution. When the skull was examined by Bathurst's sister, she claimed it could not be him. She argued that the skull was too small, the forehead not prominent enough to match her brother's distinctive profile. Whether this was a sister's denial or a factual observation remains a point of contention. But there is a darker detail regarding the porter, Mertens. Records indicate that shortly after Bathurst's disappearance, the porter Mertens, a man of humble means, suddenly came into money. He purchased the house where the skull was found. He eventually started a business. Where did the capital come from? The timeline of his financial ascent aligns perfectly with the disappearance of the wealthy diplomat. If we stitch these anomalies together, the picture shifts from a supernatural vanishing to a disjointed, chaotic crime. The theory that emerges is one of mundane brutality compounded by political cover-ups. It is possible that Bathurst, checking his horses in the dark, was struck on the head by someone lurking in the shadows, perhaps the porter, perhaps a French agent, or perhaps a combination of both. The removal of the trousers and their placement in the woods 3 miles away serves as the most confusing variable. If Mertens killed him for the gold and the coat, why travel to Quitzo to dump the trousers? Why leave the letter? This suggests a second party. It implies that while the body may have been hidden under the stable floor by a greedy porter, the effects were taken by someone else, someone who wanted to simulate a flight, or someone who was interrupted while rifling through the pockets in the woods. There is also the report of the blue cellar. Local rumors in Perleberg persisted for years that Bathurst had been held in the cellar of the town hall or a nearby official building before being killed. This aligns with the involvement of higher powers. If the local authorities were complicit, or if French agents had bribed the local magistrate, the confusion of the investigation makes perfect sense. Captain von Klitzing's investigation was thorough, yet he hit walls at every turn. Was he being obstructed by his own people? The anomalies of the Bathurst case refuse to settle into a single narrative. We have the swiftness of the vanish, which defies physics. We have the psychological break, which suggests suicide or accidental death, yet is contradicted by the hidden body. We have the theft of the coat, but the abandonment of the trousers. We have the porter's sudden wealth and the sister's refusal to identify the skull. Ultimately, the disappearance of Benjamin Bathurst remains a mosaic of jagged pieces that do not quite fit. It is a story where the silence of the snow-covered ground speaks louder than the witnesses. He stepped around a carriage and walked out of history, leaving behind only questions and a pair of empty pantaloons in a frozen wood, a testament to a fate that was as cold as the Prussian winter. The silence that followed the vanishing of Benjamin Bathurst was not a quiet one. It was a chaotic, bureaucratic noise that echoed through the cobblestone streets of Perleberg and reverberated all the way to the gilded halls of London and Paris. When a man dissolves into the ether between the door of an inn and the step of his carriage, the human mind rushes to fill the void with logic, and when logic fails, it turns to accusation. This phase of the mystery is defined not by what was found, but by the maddening accumulation of trails that led precisely nowhere. These were the dead ends, the fragments of evidence that promised resolution, but delivered only deeper confusion. The initial investigation fell upon the shoulders of Captain von Klitzing, the Prussian military governor of the town. By all accounts, Klitzing was a man of efficiency, driven by the terrified realization that a British diplomat had just evaporated under his watch during a time of extreme political volatility. He mobilized his soldiers immediately. They did not merely look, they tore the town apart. Every house in Perleberg was searched. Soldiers plunged pikes into haylofts and dragged the freezing waters of the river Stepanitz. They pried up floorboards and interrogated the staff of the White Swan Inn with a rigor that bordered on brutality. The first dead end was the valet Kraus. He was the man standing closest to Bathurst, the last tether to reality before the diplomat stepped into the shadow of the horses. Klitzing had Kraus arrested and interrogated, operating on the timeless assumption that the servant always knows the master's secrets. But Kraus was nothing more than a frightened man, bewildered by the loss of his employer and the sudden hostility of the Prussian authorities. He told the same story over and over until his voice was hoarse. Bathurst had walked around the horses to the front of the carriage. That was it. There was no secret meeting, no signal, no sudden flight. Kraus was eventually released, a dead end in human form, leaving the authorities with no suspect and no narrative. Then nature offered a clue, or perhaps a mockery of one. 2 weeks after the disappearance, on the 26th of November, 1809, 2 women gathering wood in a small forest roughly 3 miles from Perleberg stumbled upon something that did not belong among the pine needles and frost. It was a pair of trousers. They were not the rough-spun wool of a peasant or the uniform of a soldier. These were fine pantaloons, undeniably the property of a gentleman. They were quickly identified as belonging to Benjamin Bathurst. This discovery sent a jolt of electricity through the investigation. if the trousers were here, surely the man or his corpse was nearby. The location, known as the Quitso Woods, was scoured. Every bush was beaten, every hollow inspected. The discovery, however, raised more questions than it answered. The trousers had been turned inside out. They were lying on the ground as if discarded in haste. Yet there was no sign of a struggle in the immediate earth. No blood on the fabric, and no cuts to suggest they had been forcibly removed. But it was what was found inside the pockets that transformed the artifact from a piece of clothing into a haunting testament of Bathurst's mental state. Inside the pocket was a letter. It was unfinished, scribbled on a scrap of paper, addressed to his wife, Phillida. The handwriting was jagged, the words steeped in the paranoia that had consumed him during his journey across Germany. He wrote that he was surrounded by enemies, that he feared he would never reach England, and that his destruction was imminent. It was a voice from the grave, confirming his terror, but offering no coordinates to his location. The trousers were a paradox. If Bathurst had been murdered by robbers, why leave the trousers? Why leave the letter? If he had been abducted by French spies, as he so fervently feared, why would they strip him in the woods and leave the evidence? And if, as some cynics suggested, he had staged his own disappearance to escape the pressures of his office and his mind, why would he walk 3 miles into a freezing November forest and remove his pants? The trail at the Quitso Woods went cold almost as soon as it was found. The trousers were not a map. They were a monument to the inexplicable. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation shifted from a local police matter to an international incident. The family of Benjamin Bathurst, wealthy and influential, refused to let the silence settle. His sister, Phillida Thistlethwaite, became the driving force of a search that would span years. She was a woman of formidable will, unwilling to accept the indifferent shrugs of Prussian officials or the stonewalling of the French. Mrs. Thistlethwaite traveled to the continent herself, a dangerous journey for an Englishwoman in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars. She was armed with gold and a relentless desperation. She met with Captain von Klitzing. She walked the muddy track outside the White Swan. She even managed, through sheer tenacity and high-level connections, to obtain assurances from Napoleon Bonaparte himself that the French government knew nothing of the affair. The emperor, usually indifferent to the fate of a single Englishman, granted her passports and safe conduct, ostensibly to prove that his secret police had not snatched the diplomat. This, too, was a dead end. If the most powerful man in Europe claimed ignorance, and if his vast intelligence network offered no files on the matter, the theory of political assassination began to lose its structural integrity. In her quest, Mrs. Thistlethwaite was presented grisly offers of closure. The reward money she posted turned the countryside into a grotesque treasure hunt. Peasants and soldiers brought her rumors of bodies. On several occasions, unidentified corpses found in the region were shown to her. She looked into the faces of dead strangers, searching for the features of her brother. Each time she turned away. They were too short, too old, or simply not him. The hope that buoyed her journey began to curdle into a grim routine of anticipation and disappointment. The years rolled on, and the mystery of Perleberg ossified into local legend. The White Swan Inn continued to serve ale. The horses continued to trot down the Hamburg road, and the name Benjamin Bathurst became a ghost story told to frighten children. But the earth has a way of spitting out its secrets, even if it does so slowly. In 1852, more than 4 decades after the disappearance, a final, tantalizing dead end emerged. A house in Perleberg was being renovated. It was a house that had belonged to a man named Schmidt, who had worked as a porter at the White Swan on that fateful night in 1809. Schmidt had long been a figure of peripheral suspicion. He was known to have money that he could not account for shortly after the disappearance, but nothing had ever stuck. While lifting the threshold of a stable explicitly connected to the property, workmen discovered a human skeleton. It was buried face down, the skull battered as if by a heavy blow from a blunt instrument. The location was damning. The injury was consistent with a surprise attack from behind, perhaps a blow delivered as a man checked his carriage in the dark. The authorities believed they had finally solved the riddle. The skeleton was of a man of Bathurst's height. One of the molars in the lower jaw showed signs of dental work that would have been expensive, the mark of a wealthy man. The timeline fit. The location fit. The motive, robbery by a corrupt porter, fit the mundane, ugly reality of crime better than the grand theories of French espionage. They called for Bathurst's sister. Phillida Thistlethwaite was old now, her grief a dull, familiar ache. She traveled once more to Germany to look upon the remains. She stood over the skull that had been pulled from the dirt under the stable floor. The officials waited for the weeping, for the recognition, for the closure of the file. Instead, she shook her head. She pointed out that the skull lacked a specific extraction her brother had undergone years before his disappearance. She noted the teeth were too perfect, too complete. This was not Benjamin, she declared. She refused to accept the bones. Was she right? Or was she a woman who had lived with the ghost of her brother for so long that the reality of a dirty skeleton in a porter's stable was too banal to bear? She returned to England, and the skeleton was buried anonymously in the local churchyard. The porter Schmidt was long dead, unable to confess or deny. This was the ultimate dead end. a body that fit the description, found in the home of a suspect, rejected by the only living witness who could identify it. The investigation did not end with a period, but with an ellipsis. The trousers in the woods, the letter in the pocket, the denial of the emperor, and the skull under the floorboards, all of them were pieces of a puzzle that refused to lock together. They were facts that existed in isolation, orbiting a center that was simply missing. Benjamin Bathurst remained nowhere. The noise of the investigation faded, replaced once again by the silence of the Perleberg night, leaving only the unsettling truth that a man can be surrounded by people, by laws, and by nations, and still step off the edge of the world, leaving nothing behind but a pair of empty trousers and a century of questions. The year is 1809, and the map of Europe is being violently redrawn by the ambition of one man. Napoleon Bonaparte has the continent in a chokehold, and the roads of Germany are treacherous veins of paranoia, espionage, and shifting allegiances. It is against this backdrop of geopolitical terror that we find Benjamin Bathurst, a young, brilliant, and deeply anxious British diplomat, racing toward a destiny that defies all logic. He is not merely a man traveling home. He is a man hunted, or at least a man who believes he is being hunted with a fervor that borders on hysteria. Bathurst carries with him critical diplomatic dispatches from Vienna, intended for the eyes of the Foreign Secretary in London. He is traveling under the alias Baron de Kock, a flimsy shield against the network of French spies he is convinced surrounds him. On the 25th of November, his carriage clatters into the small, unremarkable Prussian town of Perleberg. It is a stop necessitated by the need for fresh horses. But for Bathurst, it becomes the terminus of his existence. What happens next is not a matter of fog or superstition, but a documented impossibility that has kept investigators and historians awake for over 2 centuries. The setting is crucial to understanding the anomaly. The White Swan Inn is a sturdy structure, flanked by other buildings, creating a sense of enclosure. It is not a desolate outpost on a moor. It is a bustling post house in a town teeming with soldiers and travelers. Bathurst arrives in a state of high agitation. He drafts a letter to his wife, Phillida, expressing his fear that he will never reach England and that his destruction is imminent. He requests the commander of the local Prussian guard to provide him with protection, a request that is granted. 2 soldiers are assigned to the inn. The stage is set with witnesses, guards, and a clearly defined physical space. At approximately 9 in the evening, the new horses are harnessed. The night is dark, the air biting with the chill of late autumn, illuminated only by the dim glow of carriage lanterns and the ambient light from the inn's windows. Bathurst decides to supervise the departure himself. He steps out of the inn, wearing a heavy, expensive fur coat and gray pantaloons. He is flanked by his personal valet, Hilbert, and his secretary, Cross. The proximity of these men cannot be overstated. They are not watching him from a balcony or a distant window. They are standing within arm's reach, amidst the stamping of hooves and the creaking of leather. Bathurst walks around to the front of the carriage, ostensibly to check the horses, or perhaps to give an order to the postilion. He steps around the heads of the horses, moving from the light of the lantern into the shadow cast by the animals, and then silence. He does not cry out. There is no sound of a struggle, no scuffle of boots on cobblestones, no muffled plea. There is no gunshot. Hilbert and Cross wait for him to emerge on the other side of the carriage. Seconds tick by, stretching into a minute. They call out to him, perhaps expecting him to be adjusting a strap or inspecting a wheel. There is no answer. Puzzled, they walk around the carriage to find him. The space is empty. The ground is solid. The soldiers are at their posts. Benjamin Bathurst has ceased to exist in the observable world. This is the moment the signal begins, a discordant note in reality that refuses to resolve. The immediate search is frantic and thorough. Captain von Klitzing, the Prussian commander who had met Bathurst earlier, is summoned. He is a man of military precision, not given to flights of fancy. He orders a dragnet. The inn is turned upside down. Every room, cellar, and attic is scoured. The soldiers use lanterns to inspect every inch of the courtyard. They poke bayonets into piles of straw and check the nearby river stepanits. The town guards seal the gates of Perleberg. No one leaves without inspection. If Bathurst had been murdered, where was the body? A dead weight of 160 pounds is not easily concealed in a matter of seconds without noise. If he had been kidnapped, where were the assailants? The courtyard was enclosed, and the only exit was watched. If he had fled voluntarily, why leave behind his dispatches, his money, and his desperate desire to return to his family? The investigation that follows is where the mystery deepens from a disappearance into a haunting. A few days after the event, a fur coat is discovered in an outhouse belonging to a family named Schmidt, who worked at the inn. It is Bathurst's coat. It is found bundled up, hidden away. This discovery points toward robbery and murder, a tangible motive. The Schmidts are interrogated, their lives dismantled by suspicion, but no body is found, and they vehemently deny involvement in the diplomat's death. The coat is a lingering artifact, a piece of the puzzle that fits nowhere. If he was murdered for his coat, why was he killed without a sound in a crowded yard? And how was his body whisked away before the coat was hidden? Weeks turn into months, and the signal from Perleberg grows faint but persistent. The British government, initially suspecting a French plot, puts immense pressure on the Prussians. Napoleon himself, when accused of spiriting Bathurst away to a dungeon, denies it with characteristic arrogance, calling the suggestion madness. The French police records, opened years later, show no trace of Bathurst. He was not a prisoner of the state. The agony of the uncertainty draws Phillida Bathurst to Germany. She is a woman possessed by a singular need for truth. She walks the muddy streets of Perleberg, offering rewards that equate to a fortune for the locals. She funds the draining of ponds and the digging of fields. Her presence keeps the signal alive, forcing the town to remember the man who vanished. It is during her relentless campaign that another piece of physical evidence surfaces, 3 years after the disappearance. 2 women gathering wood in the forest of Quitzo, a few miles from Perleberg, find a pair of pantaloons. They are weather-beaten, lying in the undergrowth. Upon inspection, they are identified as belonging to Bathurst. Inside the pocket, remarkably, is a paper, a letter to his wife. It is unfinished, scribbled in pencil, speaking of his fear and his love. But the trousers present a jarring inconsistency. They contain 2 bullet holes, yet there is no blood. An expert examination suggests the holes were made by the garment being hung up and shot at, rather than being worn during a fatal encounter. Was this a planted clue, a cruel taunt, or evidence of a staged death gone wrong? The discovery of the trousers in the woods contradicts the theory of a quick burial in the town. If he walked to the woods, how did he leave the guarded town? If he was carried, why strip him there? The narrative of Benjamin Bathurst usually ends with the supernatural, the idea that he slipped through a crack in time. A favorite trope of science fiction writers who seized upon the story in the 20th century. But the investigative eye must look at the ground, not the stars. The lingering signal points to a conspiracy of silence within Perleberg itself. Decades pass. The Napoleonic Wars end. Europe rebuilds. The mystery of the Englishman becomes local folklore, a ghost story to frighten children. Then, in 1852, over 40 years after the event, the signal pulses once more. During the demolition of a house in Perleberg, a house that had belonged to a porter who worked at the White Swan, a human skeleton is discovered buried under the stone threshold of the stable. The discovery sends a shockwave through the diplomatic community. The skeleton belongs to a man of Bathurst's height. The skull shows a fracture at the back, consistent with a heavy blow from a blunt instrument. This aligns with the theory of a sudden, silent attack from behind in the darkness of the carriage yard. It suggests he was killed instantly, his body dragged into a nearby cellar or stable, and buried under the floorboards while the search raged outside. However, the resolution is snatched away. Bathurst's sister is brought to examine the remains. She travels to Germany, an old woman now, carrying the memory of her brother. She looks at the skull and declares it is not him. She claims the jawline is different. The teeth do not match. But was this the truth? Or was it a denial born of a need for a more noble end than a sordid murder by a stable hand for a purse of gold? Some reports suggest the sister was shown the wrong skull, or that the authorities, eager to close the case, mishandled the evidence. The skeleton is eventually discarded, lost to history, just as Bathurst was. What remains is the unsettled nature of the event. The lingering signal is the combination of these disparate, conflicting facts. We have the psychological terror of a man convinced he is being hunted. We have the physical impossibility of the disappearance in a crowded, lit courtyard. We have the fur coat in the outhouse, the pantaloons in the forest, and the skeleton under the stable. None of them form a complete picture. They are fragments of different puzzles mixed together. To stand in the market square of Perleberg today is to feel the weight of that unfinished narrative. The cobblestones are silent, but the archives scream with contradictions. The disappearance of Benjamin Bathurst remains one of the few historical mysteries that resists every conventional explanation. It is a locked room mystery where the room is the world itself. The signal continues to broadcast, a low-frequency hum of anxiety and confusion, reminding us that sometimes people do not just die, they are erased, leaving behind only the static of unanswered questions and the faint, lingering echo of footsteps that simply stopped.